In the year 1924, the Society for Studies of Interplanetary Travel was founded. This acted as a launchpad for the USSR's future space travel programs, launching programs such as the Intercontinental Missile, Sputnik 1, Luna 3, the Zond 5, the Vostok 1, the Salyut 1, and the Mir. On August 21, 1957, the first ICBM, or Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, was fired off in the USSR. But before that, the US tried to fire off the Atlas to make the US the first with the ICBM. But the missile failed, tumbling at 5,000 feet and crashing into the ground. Soon after, the USSR fired off their own ICBM, claiming the missile as a success. Russia pulled ahead in the space race.
In 1957, the USSR escalated the new space race by launching Sputnik, a small satellite at about the size of a beach ball. With a diameter of 22.8 inches. It weighed 183.9 pounds and completed a full orbit of Earth. The United States saw this as a major offensive because the Soviet Union had bested them.
On October 31st, 1957, Lakia, the first dog to orbit Earth, was strapped into the capsule of Sputnik 2. She had leather straps that prevented her from turning around, but could eat her jelly food. A few hours later, this silver ball, very similar to Sputnik 1, was put on top of the R-7 rocket. Then, on November 3rd, the countdown reached 0. Lakia orbited on an elliptical path that was about 530 feet high on average. The engineers were unable to think of a way to shield the satellite from the heat of re-entry, so Lakia was given a lethal injection instead of running out of oxygen.
On January 2nd, 1959, the Luna 1 was launched by the USSR. Luna 1 was a small object, only being 40 inches in diameter. The Luna 1 was chiefly designed in order to measure the moon's magnetic field, which after being measured was seen not to be that strong. Then about 8 months and 10 days later, on September 12, 1959, the Luna 2 was launched, but after the Luna 1 launching at 3,245.2 pounds, after being converted from kilograms, the Luna 2 was seen as substantially larger at the weight of 3,858 pounds. It was the first object to hit the moon. Right between the craters of Archimedes and Autoculus in the Mare Imbrium. But right after it was supposed to land, signals stopped coming from it. Then moving on to the third, it was launched exactly 2 years from the original launch date as Sputnik. Its main goal was to take pictures of the dark side of the moon. After launching, it met its goal, taking a total of 29 blurry but discernible pictures of Mare Crisium, or known as the Sea of Crises, and other parts of the moon, covering 70% of the far side of the moon. Then the bad programs popped up. 4 through 8 all had intentions of making a soft landing on the moon, but they all failed. Then to the saving grace of the Luna 9 with the first soft landing on the moon, and it took 7 years to get done, but it landed in the Oceanus Procellarum. Fun fact, some scientists actually thought that the surface of the moon was made out of dust, so humans and other objects could not land on the surface.
Luna etne Luna, Luna pil.
But after the confirmation of the Luna 9, human landing was starting to be prepared.
People need love.
After the Luna 9 comes the Luna 10, obviously, which achieved a first of lunar orbit. While orbiting around the moon, it completed 460 rotations around the Earth, using its instruments to gather micrometeoric particles and gamma radiations that were emitted by the moon.
Further in the Luna program comes the Luna 11 and the Luna 12. Both of these missions succeeded and got into lunar orbit. Luna 13 actually landed on the moon in the Ocean of Storms. Then Luna 14 made a successful orbit of the moon in 1968. So the Soviets were showing dominance in space before the successful United States mission in 1969 of Apollo 11. Luna 15 was launched to do what Apollo 11 did shortly after the United States, but failed and just crashed into the moon. Luna 16 in 1970 returned 101 grams of soil from the moon to Earth.
Do you have the soil?
By using a fancy drill fashioned to work like a human arm. Later that year, Luna 17 delivered a rover, Luna Cod 1, which sent 20,000 photos back to Earth. It may have gotten more, but it froze and shut down. The next Luna program, 18, crashed. Luna 19 was launched very soon after and completed an orbit of the moon 1,000 times. Luna 20 in 1972 returned soil samples from the moon, where on Earth they were given to the United States for research there. Luna 21 delivered another rover to take more moon photos. Luna 22 made upward of 4,000 orbits of the moon, 23 landed successfully, and 24 returned more soil samples.
With many victories under his belt, such as the first ICBM putting Sputnik into space, Sergei Pavlovich Korolev launched the Venera 1 into space. It was a huge victory, with the top stage of the rocket going into the heliocentric orbit around Venus. But it was lucky that the rocket even made it off of the ground, which is with its sister ship, the Venera 1VA number 1, not even able to break the Earth's atmosphere. But with the rotations around Venus, there became a much more accurate measurement of how large our solar system is.
The Soviet Union in 1961 became the first nation to send a person into space, Yuri Gagarin. In 29 minutes, Yuri made a full orbit of the Earth, however was in no control of his ship the whole time, as it was an entirely ground-controlled mission. Nevertheless, the Soviets had achieved a tremendous feat and put the first real person into an orbit around Earth. Gagarin gained international fame and recognition, only to be killed 7 years later in a plane crash. Because he's a communist.
Voskhod 2 was a mission where humans took the first tentative steps outside of their spacecraft. The Soviet Union selected Pavel Bayevlev and Alexei Leonov to train for this ambitious endeavor. Voskhod 2 was focused primarily on testing the ability of a human to survive in space without a spacecraft to protect them from extreme temperatures, radiation, and micrometeoroids. Alexei trained rigorously for 2 years to prepare for this voyage. On March 18, 1965, the crew of Voskhod 2 blasted off. To expel nitrogen from his body, Alexei performed an hour-long breathing activity. The spacewalk was taken inside a spacesuit with pressure 40% of sea level. The suit had a tendency to balloon and become stiff, so Alexei had some trouble moving and actually got stuck trying to re-enter the spacecraft for 8 minutes. The craft also had trouble with its re-entry to the atmosphere, and Bayevlev had to make the Soviet Union's first manual re-entry. They landed 2,000 kilometers off target and spent a night hiding in their spacecraft from a pack of wolves.
The Zond 5 is one of the prime examples of a country winging it. It all started when the Zond was fired off out of a Sputnik that was in a parking orbit. But on the way to the moon, the main stellar altitude surface screen became contaminated and was rendered unusable. So the backup sensors were used to guide them to the moon. On September 18, 1968, the spacecraft flew around the moon at the lowest altitude of 1,950 kilometers. And high-quality pictures of the Earth were taken at a distance of 90,000 kilometers. There was also a biological payload inside of the Zond 5. It consisted of turtles, wine-flies, mealworms, plants, seeds, bacteria, and other living matter. But then in the pilot seat, there was a 70-kilogram or 154.3 pound for any American stupid enough to be in the room. The dummy had radiation sensors on it, but don't worry, this is the bad part. While coming into re-entry, another altitude sensor, the backup one broke, so they didn't think to make a backup of the backup sensor. So the only option to get to the ground was using something called a ballistic entry. In case you don't know what a ballistic entry is, it is an entry where the only forces present are gravity and aerodynamic drag. This type of re-entry is usually labeled as extremely dangerous because of the use of no thrusters, and since the entry is a lot steeper than a non-ballistic entry, there's a lot larger of a chance of fatalities and fire on the ship. After the landing, it was found that none of the biological specimens seemed to suffer any type of harm. The worst that possibly happened was that the turtles had lost 10 pounds, but their eating habits were still the same and they were active.
The Soviets had yet another first by having the first space station with the Soyuz 4 and Soyuz 5. The Soyuz 4 got into orbit first, and after orbiting the Earth 34 times, it was approached by the Soyuz 5, which docked with the other ship and completely synced up their operating systems. The Russian crew aboard the Soyuz 5 climbed into the Soyuz 4, thus completing the first space station. This would be the first time anyone had climbed into another spacecraft mid-flight, which would prove vital to future space endeavors by every country.
Salyut 1 was launched in 1971 and became the first manned space station. The station was 43 feet long and was basically just a set of pressurized tubes for the cosmonauts and one unpressurized for the propellant storage. On June 7, 1971, the Soyuz 11 brought the first cosmonauts. The three stayed in the station for 23 days. Unfortunately, on the return trip, the descent module of the Soyuz 11 depressurized and the three men died. When did I do today?
The Mars 3 for the stupid Americans in the room, or the Marsnik 3 for the very smart Soviets, depending on what country you were looking at it from, is the same mission as the Mars 2 was. The same type of spacecrafts and orbiters on them. And the mission of theirs was to go to Mars and gather samples, as well as gathering meteorological data and pictures for people to study. The capsule was about 1.2 meters in diameter, also fitted with a 2.9 meter conical aerodynamic braking shield. Multiple gas micro-engines and nitrogen tanks worked as the altitude controllers. And it was fitted with a 360-degree television screens. But something special about these missions is an extra thing that both the Mars 2 and the Mars 3 brought was called a prop-M rover. This rover worked in a type of walking style with 2 skis per feet. The robot was attached to a 15-meter cable for direct communication to the capsule. Now, but none of this technology helped the mission, because 90 seconds after landing on Mars, the capsule started to send out information, but 20 seconds into sending information, it stopped sending information. The most possible idea for this happening was a Martian dust storm was just picking up as it hit the Mars 3, killing it.
The Apollo-Soyuz test project was the first form of cooperation between the United States and the USSR. Unfortunately, this would be a one-time ordeal, as the two did not try again. As for the mission, the two countries would separately construct docking mechanisms to latch onto one single docking module in space. NASA built the docking module to allow movement from the Russian side to the American side, and vice versa. The astronauts on both sides had to maneuver their respective rockets to link up with the DM, all the while traveling at speeds near 17,000 miles per hour. A televised handshake between the two commanders was seen all over the world.
Doc comrades.
Capitalism.
This mission was primarily seen as a symbol of non-hatred rather than for scientific purposes. However, there were some studies that were conducted. The astronauts aboard shared a meal, exchanged gifts, and were greeted by their leaders together as one. A significant test on this mission was to photograph the sun's corona, which is the hottest part of its atmosphere. The Apollo craft would block the sun slightly so that the Soviet craft could obtain a clear and not too intense photo. Then the two would redock temporarily before the Soyuz craft would return to Earth. The end. 3, 2, 1.
12 more after the first, the Venera 13 was used to take advantage to launch to Venus. The capsule was hermetically sealed, and inside were all the instruments that would be needed to study. Once the capsule landed, it spent an amazing 127 minutes on the surface, which is surprising considering that it was only supposed to stay there for 32 minutes. Also, the surface of Venus has read-in at about 855 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 457 degrees Celsius, and the pressure of about 89 Earth atmospheres. Then after the information was handed off to the ship that was in orbit, the ship in orbit then returned to Earth with the first colored pictures of Venus.
Mir launched on February 20th, 1986. The space station was 20 tons and was made very similarly to the Salyut 1, and that it was actually just a series of space stations. However, some of the space that was previously experimental was now private cabins and a gymnasium. The first crew spent 125 days in space. This was then extended when the two preceding cosmonauts stayed for 6 months, one of them, and the other for 326 days. Mir experienced many problems leading up to its demise in 2000, including many fires.
So after years of disaster, dead dogs, more dead dogs, and eventually 2 living dogs, landings on multiple planets, and the occasional cosmonaut that died like the dogs, the Soviet Union dissolved, and along with it, the many programs and projects that were thought up by the Soviets blended into the background of modern history. The Soviet space programs will always be a part of history, but it will never be forgotten.
Yuri Gagarin. He was put into orbit for 29 minutes and 1 orbit. Oh, the Soyuz 4 got into orbit and after orbiting, NASA built the docking mechanism. Right. The astronauts aboard share the meal. Are you gonna say master's wrong again?
Over the thing, and I...
Are you ready?
Like, you have, like...
Nope, hit a branch.
Oh my.
We good? We good?
Luna etne Luna, Luna pit.